So, what is managerial economics? I'm going to just talk about that today. Hopefully, this is going to help you out. I think the biggest sort of belief with managerial economics is an idea that you can understand decision making such that you can have a better ideas of what decisions actually look like and what are appropriate decisions that can be. And at the base of it is a rational decision making model. And this sort of propagates much of managerial economics. And even the modern stuff is sort of a a pushback against this sort of rational model. But this rational model is very simple, right? So the rational model is that you have alternatives that exist. You're trying to solve some sort of problem. You come up with some sort of problem, you have some alternatives that exist, and then you pick the best one given the resources that you actually have and the constraints that you actually have that is going to maximize your expected performance in the long run. It seems very, very simple. That's sort of built into all of the infrastructure of sort of managerial economics, and the infrastructure being generally mathematical models. There was sort of a pivot that happened in that field that became a lot more mathematical 50, probably a little more than 50 years ago. And there's been this real emphasis on mathematics and really going into that and sort of applying a mathematical sense and believing that, some of the sort of beliefs is that there is a true answer that exists in this world, and then we can arrive upon them, and that individuals given across all individuals are all going to sort of behave in the same sort of way based on this very simple model that is built within the managerial economics model. Now, the other thing to realize is that modern managerial economics, if you start looking at the literature, now I don't look at it very like all the time. I would say I am in the realm of sort of behavioral person. I kind of meander and think about things broadly, in terms of behavior that happens within organizations, and particularly decision making and learning. But broadly in that area, there is this sort of pushback against this sort of very basic model, right? And it's been going on for a long time, and we're trying to discover, how do managers actually learn, how do they actually make decisions? What does that look like? And we're finding out that it's far different than the sort of basic model that we have. This is a very simplistic model that we have. I think von Neumann, many years ago, was sort of participating. There was a group of people that sort of develop this particular model, and then we've sort of branched out from there. Now, that is one sort of segment of managerial economics. There's sort of different angles that you could take, right? One of them is more on the industrial economics side of things, industrial organization. I think that's what they call it, where you analyze what happens within a organization given the sort of mathematical infrastructure that we have. Some amount of productivity that we can gain given inputs like capital, like labor, and then we look at the sort of advantage at gains that you get, productivity gains that we actually get, right? And so one important model that is in there, and this is sort of closer to my home, is the learning curve. We could see that there's productivity gains that happen because of knowledge, because of social capital, which is the sort of relationships that happen between individuals, but a lot of different things, right? And we're looking at what is that productivity gain that we can actually get. And so part of that as well is competition with other industry players that happen, right? And so that's where you might get into things like game theory, where you would think about how other people would behave relative to what you are actually doing, given that you're in a competitive market and you have a limited amount of resources that are available. You can see that a lot of this is really thinking about the world in terms of scarce resources, and that there is one true answer that you arrive upon, or maybe it's multiple true answers, right? I think you could get what's called multiple equilibrium, I believe, way back when in sort of game theory. that I took. But the basic story behind this is, how do we maximize our potential, given the amount of resources that we actually have? And in my view, in the way I've sort of I take the world is, I don't think we maximize as much as we think we do. Herbert Simon, who is pretty influential both in economics and psychology and all sorts of stuff, um, said that we satisfice, do things that are good enough. Even then, I don't even know if we do that. I think even the belief that we have this sort of goal-oriented self is it's a bit of a troubling belief, but it's also very much part of the infrastructure of almost all modern investigation of human beings, that we're sort of very goal-oriented. Do I necessarily believe that? For some people, yes. I think people are goal-oriented, but I think a lot of people aren't. And a lot of what we want to investigate now with managerial economics and sort of these fields in general is, why doesn't it behave that way, or why don't we do these kind of things? And so I think if you were to look at managerial economics, I think what you'd get a good sense for is that there are moments where we do behave in a way where we do maximize our potential, given the limited amount of resources. But then you also come back, I would hope, from a good program, that you would come back and think about, like, hey, this doesn't hold in all areas of my life. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it's kind of interesting to investigate it in this kind of way, but sometimes it doesn't. And now, why is that the case? What's actually going on there? And that's where a lot of research is going on, and it'll continue to go on for a long, long time, is sort of thinking about, where doesn't this hold, where we're sort of very goal-oriented, we maximize our potential, we have limited resources. Oh, the other thing is to think about supply and demand, although that is it's a rudimentary idea within managerial economics, is sort of supply and demand, but it's very important. I say it's rudimentary because it's sort of the starting ground to realize that there is a limited amount of resources. And if you do have this sort of supply infrastructure, you can gain a lot of knowledge about that. But here's the thing, I study entrepreneurship, right? So I'm kind of at the cusp of all these kind of things. That's why I'm a little confused in who I am. I don't think an entrepreneur ever thinks at all, ever, about supply and demand. I think they pursue a problem, and they sort of just are like, okay, let's see what happens. So it's not necessarily supply and demand, and as you sort of think about it, these curves that go like that. And so there's all these kind of teasing parts, I guess, that managerial economics has a really good understanding of what we can actually do with limited amount of resources, given if we acted very rationally, even boundedly, what's called boundedly rational. We're kind of like, okay, we have limited capability to understand the world. It does pretty good with explaining some of these things, but then, if you start pushing it and you start thinking about your own life, do I maximize all of my potential all the time? Heck no. Do I think that there are people that, do I think that the world is better off if we maximize all of our potential? I do think that we would do better, but I think that there's limited amounts of that we can actually gain from that, because other things would sort of fall apart. And that's where you start thinking about this sort of combination of, these interacting difficult goals that may not be, maybe they're complementary and maybe they're substitutes. There's another sort of idea that comes in, is complementary resources versus substitute resources. But there's this rather large sort of infrastructure in terms of how to understand the world, given that we have these very concrete ideas of what things are. and that we have limited amount of resources to pursue different things, and we as human beings we're always trying to maximize our potential, um, and do really well, right, in this world, and all of those things. If you start looking at that, and there's scarce resources, and if you look at all the world around us, you're gonna start thinking, yeah, that makes sense in a lot of ways, but some ways it doesn't. And I think that's where a good program, a good understanding of what managerial economics is about is going to be very helpful for you. So, all right, give me a thumbs up and take care. Have a wonderful day. Bye.